I'd like to welcome you in the name of the Old Town Swindon Partnership of Churches, Bathrow Methodist, Christ Church with St Mary's, where I am vicar, and United Reformed Church, and our partnership message. The oldest ecumenical partnership in Britain, 51 years old, 1969 we were founded. We've been asked, what does it mean to be eco-congregations in our worship, prayer, teaching, stewardship, environmental care and practical action? Martin Palmer, son of one of our ecumenical founders, Derek, inspired us in our gold anniversary celebrations and wrote with Celebration Earth colleagues, hope for the whole of creation. 6 prophetic challenges we used in Lent. We are blessed to be able to make our Friends of Christ Church annual lecture a webinar because of the coronavirus pandemic. So look forward to a public lecture with Martin, God willing, in Christ Church on Friday 23rd of October, 27th of November, 7:30. Martin is many things. He's our friend, an environmentalist, historian, theologian, Chinese scholar, ecologist, bridge builder between faith communities. Above all, he's a joyful storyteller. Martin, welcome as you speak and respond to our questions on the theme, Not Back to Normal, Planning for a Better Future. God bless you and God bless God's world tonight.
Well, good evening. And Simon, thank you for a lovely, warm welcome from a place I love greatly, Christ Church Swindon, and for mentioning my dad. And a huge thanks to Steve and to Phil for setting this up, and also to Sue, who created this magnificent icon, which I have to say, for me, captures more than I will ever be able to say in words. We are a storytelling species. That's what we are. We communicate through stories. We don't really communicate through data, which is why we're heading towards the 26th conference of the parties on climate change, because the last 25, full of data, have not really got us very much further. And also, there was a real problem, I think. I've never met anybody who was actually converted by a pie chart. I met a lot of people who've been converted by stories. I met a lot of people who've been converted by disasters or by wonderful things that have happened to them. But we are a storytelling species. And I think one of our problems often is that we think that data tells us more about the truth than anything else. And yesterday was Ascension Day. Now, Ascension Day is one of those very strange festivals in the church that we're never quite sure what to do with, in the sense that it's all about Jesus ascending into heaven. But what it is fundamentally about is the end of Easter, and the sense that the Christ who walked upon the earth is now with us in spirit and soul, walking beside us, but also our advocate in heaven. But this is where we kind of run into some of the difficulties of religious thinking and language. If you go to Walsingham, the extraordinary site, shrine of Our Lady in Norfolk, you can go to the Chapel of the Ascension. If you go into the Chapel of the Ascension and you look up above the altar, you will see a pair of concrete feet sticking through the ceiling. This is in order to represent Christ ascending. Now, the problem with that is that it is rather strange and it does make you laugh. But it is an attempt to give us a sense of a Christ who is there, but has also gone before us. But I have a very good friend who, when we were both at Cambridge, we went there, and he sat down with a sort of pencil and paper and worked out what speed Christ would have to have left the earth in order to get free of gravity. And if that was the speed that he needed to get past gravity, where would he be now if he was still traveling? And the answer was somewhere near Betelgeuse, about 200 light years away. And I suppose that for me was a moment where I thought, here is data, here is literally concrete thinking, and yet this is a wonderful story, a story that takes us somewhere else. And that's what I want to do with you this evening. I want to take you through a series of stories and events and just see if we can find how we can plan for a better future, because we cannot go back to what was normal, because it's almost destroyed us and it's almost destroyed the planet. And I'm going to use three key texts. I'm going to use Luke 24. They will appear up on the screen later. Luke 24, verse 13 to 35, the story of the disciples on the road to Emmaus. Then I'm going to use Luke 6, verses 41 to 42, the one about the log in your eye and the splinter in the other person, and then Psalm 148. So here we have a loss of normal, more dramatic than I think any of us have ever experienced before. And a question, therefore, what is normal and what do we do when normal falls apart? Now, if we could have the story of the journey to Emmaus on the screen, that would be wonderful. You probably all know the story. There are two disciples. They're leaving Jerusalem on the Sunday after the crucifixion. They're on their way to their village at Emmaus, and they are monumentally depressed. Everything they thought was normal has totally collapsed. Everything that they thought the future was going to be, the Messiah, the Christ, the whole sense of here is the end of time, we're moving into the kingdom of God, gone. They're absolutely shattered. They are like us. Everything that was normal is no longer normal. Everything they thought was reliable is no longer reliable. It just isn't working. And then you'll remember the story. A stranger comes and joins them and says, well, what are you two talking about? And they go, don't you know what's happened? Don't you know what's happened? Rather like you hear on the news today. Are you taking this seriously? Do you understand the depth of the crisis? And what happens then is that the disciples begin to talk. They talk with this stranger, and the stranger begins to explain to them why what has happened. And they're absolutely astonished. He reveals to them, in a sense, why the normal has been changed, but by taking them back into the very depth of their own tradition. He shows them that the future that they were expecting is forecast for them, but not the future they necessarily expected. And then, of course, they reach Emmaus, and the stranger's going to go on. He's traveling on. They say, no, come eat with us. Come and eat with us. And so we could have the second slide. So they go indeed, he's invited into the house, and it's only when he breaks the bread that they realize it's Jesus. It's only at that moment of companionship that they realize what they have experienced. And what they have experienced is the future. They didn't know it. And also, what's really interesting about these two is they're not very important. They're not very important at all. They're not the disciples. They're not the 12. They weren't at the Last Supper. We've never heard of them before. In fact, one of them, we don't even know what his name was. One is called Cleopas, but the other one, we've no idea who he is. Just two ordinary people whose worlds have collapsed, fallen apart, everything that was normal stripped out. And isn't that remarkable? Because the only other people that Jesus has appeared to at this point are the women at the tomb. Now, the women in traditional society, and sadly in many parts of our world today, are considered of no real significance at all. And so Jesus appears to the insignificant women, and he appears to two disciples, one of whom we've never heard of before and never hear of again. It's an extraordinary story. It's about Jesus meeting those who, in a sense, are most vulnerable, the marginalized, the on the edge people. And being on the edge is really fascinating, because it means that these are the people who are going to make the future. It's not the great and the grand. That kind of comes later. But it's actually the women. It's these disciples. It's the ones who will listen. It's a very powerful story about who Christ chooses to be the vehicles of the new vision. And I think for us as Christians, that's what this whole experience has to be about. It has to be about a sense that we are not going back to what there was before. Those disciples never went back to the fear and the collapse that they experienced walking on that road, coming from Jerusalem, where their teacher, their rabbi, had been murdered, had been killed. They never went back to that. Neither can we. We go back, we are turning our back, if you like, on the risen Christ, and we're going back only to the death and the suffering and the sadness. We will come to something more around that later, but I think this story is an immensely powerful one. Christ walks beside us as the stranger. We may not even recognize him. We may not even recognize her. What we may know is that out of the chaos, out of the failure, out of the sense that everything has fallen apart, there is one who leads us forward, and that is Christ. So what next? That's all fine, isn't it? That's lovely. You know, okay, we're not going to end up completely lost. There's hope. Christ is with us. There can be a lot of superficiality about the way in which the faiths speak and say, well, don't you worry. You know, God is with you. Christ is with you. It's going to be okay. You're going to be fine. Don't panic. You know, we'll get there in the end. Everything will sort out. And I work very closely at the moment with the Vatican, working on a group that is advising the Pope on how the Catholic Church moves forward, working also with many other faiths around the world, from the Taoists of China to the Muslims of Indonesia to the Hindus in India and so forth. And nothing irritates me more than when people say, well, now, don't you worry, it's all in God's hands. Well, yeah, maybe. I've worked for many, many years in the world of the UN, World Bank, European Union, all kinds of other groups. And what I've encountered often is that people want the faiths to speak out. They want the faiths to be moral. Well, that's very nice. And I've heard and seen many religious leaders get together and issue statements about this and demands for that. And I have to say, most of that fails and falls flat for one very simple reason. Until you actually are practicing what you preach, don't preach. When you are practicing, then you can preach. And there is too big a gap often between what the religious leaders say and what their organizations do. I'll give you one very small example. Not far from where I live, there's an eco church. Lovely bunch of people, all deeply engaged in the environmental movement and so forth. And I was invited to go and preach at their Sunday morning service. And afterwards we had a lunch. There was absolutely nothing in that lunch that was ecological. Nothing in it that was about organic or free range or fair trade. Everything was plastic cups and plastic plates, which were then binned. And when I said, but hang on, what's the link between what we've just prayed and what you've just done? And I was invited to do a harvest festival a while ago, and again, on the theme of ecology for Bath Abbey. And again, no thought had been given into the actual food that would be served at the harvest meal until I raised it, and they had to change all their plans rather dramatically and quickly. Which brings me to my second quote, the famous one about observing the splinter in your brother's eye and never noticing the great log in your own. Until faiths, and we as people of faith, have noticed the great log in our own eye, I really don't think we have much position to say that there is a splinter in the eye of others in the world. If we cannot live our faith, why should anybody believe in our faith? And one of the problems with the environmental movement, and I've worked with the environmental movement now for 40 years, I've had the sometimes slightly startling pleasure of being Prince Philip's religious advisor on the environment. We've worked together since 1985. But very often what I find is that when the secular organizations, WWF or RSPB or any of the other big environmental movements, when they say, oh, we want to work with the faiths, what they actually mean is we would like the faiths free of charge to preach our message on a Friday in the mosque, on a Saturday in the synagogue, and on the Sunday in a church. And I have to say to them, well, I'm very sorry, but that's not how it works. The faiths will preach what they preach because of what they believe. They will not just preach any old message, not even if that message coincides with what they believe. They may support it, but they will preach what they preach. And much of my professional life has been helping the major religions of the world to discover what they actually believe about the environment and about our place within it. You'd be surprised to the degree to which that had got lost or hidden or buried. But we have managed to help the faiths to uncover this and then build their own programs based upon it. But what do we actually think they should do then? Well, it's very straightforward at one level. The faiths have enormous wisdom. We've been around for 2, 3, 4, in some cases 5,000 years. We are the oldest and most sustainable organizations in the world. In 500 years' time, there won't be a WWF, there won't be a United Nations, but there will be Christians, and there will be Taoists, and there will be Hindus, and there will be Buddhists, and we will be reading our sacred books and telling our stories in God knows what kind of way or format, but we will. We'll be there. We'll still be there. So if you want to build something for the future, the faiths are the strongest building block you can find. We've made it through just about everything. But there is more than that. We are also stakeholders in the planet. For example, we still run 50% of all schools around the world. And according to UNICEF, with whom we've worked very closely, 64% of all schools in sub-Saharan Africa are run by the faiths. We run a third of all hospitals and clinics worldwide. The religions, we run those. Without us, this crisis would be even worse. It's because we're there that the numbers are lower. We own about 8% of the habitable surface of the planet. Forests, farmlands, towns, villages, cities. We produce 5% of all the commercial forestry in the world. And over the last few years, we've been able to turn that towards FSC, the Forest Stewardship Council, in 80% of all those forests. The religious forest owners are the most environmental group of forest owners in the world. One other figure, about 18% of the total investment market is owned by major religions. And I now head an organization called Faith Invest, which is working with the major religious investment houses to shift their investments. There's a lot of work that's been done on disinvesting. And in fact, this week, thanks to Operation Noah, an amazing group here in the UK, many Christian investment groups in the UK have agreed they will disinvest. 42 major investment groups, everything from the Jesuits through to the Quakers. But that's fine. That's what we're against. We're against fossil fuels. What are we for? And that's the question that we have asked. And that is our role. We are saying to the faiths, okay, given your beliefs, given your values, given what you're against, what are you for? Where will you invest to make a better future? And quite simply, if the major faiths actually move forward and then invest according to their beliefs, faith consistent in what they invest, not just how they spend the money, we will literally change the financial market. There is no question. We can change the financial market. So when we talk about what can the faiths do, it's not just preaching. It's also about the business of faiths. But there's also a greater wisdom in the faiths as well, because much of the talk you will hear in the next year will be about how we can preserve human life, how we can make it better, how we can continue to have a growth market, and so on and so forth. Well, in 1989, the ecumenical patriarch, the first amongst equals of the patriarch of the Orthodox churches, and there are about 400 million Orthodox in the world, wrote this: "We must attempt to return to a proper relationship with the Creator and the creation. This may well mean that just as a shepherd will in times of greatest hazard lay down his life for his flock. So human beings may need to forego part of their wants and needs in order that the survival of the natural world can be assured. This is a new situation, a new challenge. It calls for humanity to bear some of the pain of creation, as well as to enjoy and celebrate it. It calls first and foremost for repentance, but of an order not previously understood by many. We are the only group that will have the courage to say this will cost you, not don't worry, it won't cost you. We are the only group that will say we may actually have to give up things in order that the rest of creation can live. And I just want at this moment to reference the Thy Kingdom Come movement. I would like to change that name. I think it should be called Our Kingdom Come, because we are going to be the instruments of that change along with God, but we are the ones that will make that kingdom come alive. And we can do that in the most simple of ways as well as the most complicated ways. We, for many years, have run a program working with the major faiths on food. The faiths produce a great deal of food through the farmlands they own. They purchase a huge amount. The major religions of the world supply 500 million meals a day through their schools, their hospitals, their temples, their mosques, through their old people's homes, through their celebrations, their rituals, through their birth celebrations, through marriages, etc. We are a massive purchasing power. You are a massive purchasing power. And you can begin to change the world literally one meal at a time by what you choose to use. Now, that all sounds fine, but where does it lead us? Well, at the moment, it's leading many of the faiths to reconsider something that we did back in 2009, just before the disastrous Copenhagen COP on climate change. And that is to create long-term plans. This was an idea of His Royal Highness, the Duke of Edinburgh. And one evening, we were talking about how successful our work had been. We've worked together since 1985, 1986. When he was the international president of WWF, he asked me to bring together 5 of the major religions in Assisi, Italy, the birthplace of St. Francis, and there to launch a whole new movement amongst and with the faiths on the environment. And we were sitting kind of thinking about this in about 2007, 2008, and thinking, well, we were doing very well. The UN claimed that we had launched something like 250,000 religious projects around the world, or helped faiths to launch those. But we felt there was something not quite gripping. And so we had a chat about how that could be moved forward. And one of the great things about faiths is that if you can embed something in a faith, it's there for centuries. We'd already been quite successful in that we had got the major religions to create a particular day or a week, or in the case of Christianity, a whole new season on the environment. So we have Creation Tide now within the Christian churches. We have Lao Tzu Day in China. We have Hindu Environment Week. We have Sikh Environment Week. We have Tu B'Shvat and the Festival of New Year for Judaism and so on. That's been very successful, and they roll out every year. We don't have to do anything. They're there. They just happen. But we wanted to go deeper than that. We wanted things to become so embedded that they became literally how a faith breathed and moved. And so we came up with the idea of long-term plans for people and planet. And we launched this with Ban Ki-moon, the then Secretary General of the UN, and Prince Philip at Windsor Castle in 2009. And we asked the faiths to look at 7 areas that they were influential and powerful in. The first one was assets. We own millions of buildings as the faiths. We have to heat them. We have to restore them. We have to build them. They can become, and have become in many places, living examples of eco-building. I've already mentioned the investments. We have huge investments, and we are beginning to move those investments, partly through my new group, Faith Invest, but partly because actually the faiths are realizing that it's all very well standing on the edge and shouting at those who you think are in power, but we're actually in power. That investment is actually a larger share of the investment market than any other discernible civil society bloc. Then we asked them, number 2, to look at education and youth. Again, I go back to this fact, we run 50% of all schools around the world. There are 6 youth organizations who between them have somewhere between 350 to 400 million young people in them. Of those, 4 of the 6 have religious roots or are explicitly religious. That's the Guides and the Scouts, YMCA, YWCA. We have an enormous impact through education. We run a quarter of all higher education establishments, universities and colleges around the world. It's an enormous impact, enormous impact. In this country, 1/3 of all our primary schools are run by the churches. Then there's wisdom. Number 3 is wisdom. We've lived through a hell of a lot, and I mean a hell of a lot. We've lived through plagues, we've lived through civil wars, we've lived through the collapse of entire civilizations. We've survived droughts and floods, plagues, the lot. We've been here before. This is nothing new. This is nothing new. It's just we're more aware of it than we have been perhaps before. But we've survived it. We know how to get through these. We know how to psychologically help people make change. We know how to appear timeless and unchanging by being constantly changing, but doing it at a pace that people can actually accommodate. If we went into Christ Church in, say, 1890 and listened to what was being said then, we'd probably most run out the door and try and escape. It's not the same faith that it was then. Thank God. It's growing, it's changing. It always has done. Then we have lifestyles. The faiths are very good at lifestyles. I mean, a very simple thing. We know that you can ask people to fast. We're in the middle of Ramadan at the moment for Muslims. You can ask people to fast at Advent or in Lent. In Buddhism, people fast during Pansa, which is the rainy season. Every faith has a tradition of simple living for a period. But then we party. If you've ever been in a Muslim country when Eid al-Fitr takes place, which is at the end of Ramadan, my God, they may not drink, although I'm afraid 1 or 2 do, but the most of them do not drink. But my God, do they have a good time. A bit like my sister Yanchi, who we adopted when my parents were at Swindon. My father was vicar, and I went to work in Hong Kong for a year, and somewhat to the surprise of my parents, came home with a daughter for them. They were very kind. They did agree that she should be adopted, but quite seriously, it was quite a shock to the family. But they did enjoy it. So we have that ability. We have that ability to do things very differently, to actually bring things in that nobody else would think of. And part of that is that we do party. We do actually quite enjoy ourselves. A lot in the environmental movement kind of bring around a kind of new Puritanism. They ask everybody to give up everything forever. We know that doesn't work. We know that doesn't work. So we have lifestyles, and then we have media and advocacy. Around the world, the faiths are trusted. So when a faith community advocates something, then local communities and often nation states will actually go with that in a way that they won't go with a government, they won't go with an NGO, they won't go with the UN. They trust the faith. So for example, in sub-Saharan Africa, we've developed 2 programs, given the huge role of the faiths in agriculture in Africa. One is called Farming God's Way, and this is a Christian farming model based on biblical texts and the most up-to-date modern agricultural science, and another one called Islamic farming. Why? Because the farmers are very conservative, but if you can show that in using the best of sustainable agricultural methods, they are being faithful to their tradition, the Bible or the Quran, they will move forward in a way that no UN edict on sustainable agriculture, no conference in Vienna advocating radical changes and mindsets, no program by the national government will ever have the same effect. So media and advocacy. Number 6 is partnerships. We can't do this alone. We don't need to do this alone. We are surrounded by people with immense skills, incredible skills and knowledge, scientists, economists, teachers, educators. We are surrounded by skills. And one of the great problems often of the church is that we don't ask those people to share their skills with us. We just ask them to give us money on a Sunday or a Friday or a Saturday, depending on the faith. We have these people in our midst. We have international organizations that know what we can do and have ideas, but do not have the trust of people. We can work in partnerships. And then the final one is celebration. We celebrate. And let me tell you a story about that. My team helped create the first ever faith-based education for sustainable development toolkit. Terrible title. One of those ghastly UN titles that makes you wish that somebody who actually understood communications worked for them, but that's another story. However, the Education for Sustainable Development program is a huge program all around the world, working in something like 120 different countries. And this scheme, which we developed with colleagues in East Africa, Hindu, Muslim and Christian, was the first ever faith-based toolkit for education for sustainable development. And this is materials produced for upper end of primary schools and secondary schools all around the world in many different languages. And my colleague who developed this, Mary, went to a big conference in Japan, International Conference on Education for Sustainable Development, and she was asked to speak about it. And at the end, the chair of the meeting, clearly bewildered, said, well, now, Mary, this is very fascinating, thank you very much indeed, but what is the actual difference between a standard Education for Sustainable Development toolkit and a faith-based Education for Sustainable Development toolkit? And she smiled in a way that she can, and she said, we start by saying thank you, whereas the non-faith-based ones just start by telling you how we're going to hell in a handcart. We start by saying thank you. And when I started this work with the environmental organizations back in 1983, was my first real engagement, I went for a meeting with the International Union for Conservation and Nature. This is the major scientific body that charts the level of destruction of species around the planet. And I spoke, and there was a lot of skepticism. And then someone said afterwards, oh, actually, I've got a Bible quote on my wall. Would you like to see it? So I thought, oh, this is encouraging. You know, having been ridiculed, what on earth's religion got to do with the environment? So I went along to his room, and there was indeed an enormous poster, and it was a quote from Revelation, chapter 11, verse 8. The time has come to destroy those who are destroying the earth. That was the only message he felt religion, the Bible, had to share. And in other words, it started with an assumption that we were having to fight and destroy, rather than that we were there to celebrate, give thanks, and then, because we had given thanks, move forward. And I worry about the sort of the language in a lot of the environmental movement or the alternative economics. It's about battle, it's about fighting, it's about telling people what they cannot do, what they mustn't do. It's about stripping people right back. And there is a wonderful Jewish story or quote which says that on the day of judgment, when you stand before God, God will ask you and will condemn you for every legitimate pleasure you could have had and did not. You will be condemned for not enjoying the generosity of God. And I think that's a very salutary reminder to us that this is a fabulous and wonderful world. And if we don't celebrate it, we've missed most of the points. So we know how to fast and we know how to feast. And so we have this theme of celebration. because when we were asked, for example, to assist and bring the major faiths together with the UN on the Sustainable Development Goals in 2015, this 15-year program to try and transform the world economically, socially, environmentally, they had created 17 goals. And to their horror, the faiths at this major meeting said, "Oh, we got an 18th goal." And they went, "No, we spent 5 years developing these goals." And we said, "No, don't worry. We said, there's lots of goals in here. You want to cut infant mortality. You want to triple the amount of children in school. You want to bring health to everybody. These are amazing targets. So why don't we have an 18th goal, which is when we achieve something, let's celebrate it. Don't just tell us how it's all awful. Tell us when we've actually done something that has made a difference." And that's why I wanted to come to Psalm 148. Here we have this wonderful paean of praise, this fantastic saying thank you, and saying thank you to God for everything, for his angels, for the sun and the moon, for the sea monsters and the depths, for snow and mist, for hills and orchards, for cattle, for the earth, for young men and girls, for old people and children. It's a wonderful, wonderful reminder that this is a generous creation given to us by a loving God. And that's why in mid-September we are hosting, hopefully physically, at St. Albans and the Abbey and in the city, but if not, then virtually in partnership with the BBC and others, a thing called Celebration Earth. When we suggested this to the environmental groups, they said, "Wait, celebration? What is there to celebrate? It's all awful." And we said, well, the trouble is that unless you can celebrate something, why would you care for it? Who do we celebrate with parties? Our beloved and our loved ones. Who do we celebrate in our churches? The births and the marriages and the lives of those who've gone on. What we celebrate is what we most care about. And that's why we are holding a thing called Celebration Earth. And that psalm is a wonderful example. So how do we bring this hope, this vision, this sense that Christ will meet us on this road when we think everything has failed and the normal has been destroyed and there can be no future? How can we move forward with confidence? And how do we share that with the world? Well, first of all, let's take the log out of our own eyes. Let's actually reform what we do. Let's buy ecologically. Let's travel ecologically. Let's think ecologically. Let's pray ecologically. But then how do we share? Well, there's a wonderful quote about St. Francis when he was asked, "How do you preach the gospel?" And he said, "Shut up, shut up, and shut up." In other words, if your life isn't the gospel, if the light of Christ doesn't shine through what you do, then don't say anything, because nobody will believe you. And at the very end, we're going to read the prayer of St. Teresa. "Christ has no body now on earth but ours, no hands but ours." My father's favourite prayer. It was over his desk in the vicarage. And for me, that has always been what this is about. It's about our kingdom come, because without us, there is no better future. Without our energies and commitments, there will be no significant changes. And we don't do this alone. And so following the words of St. Francis, I will just say one more thing at this point. Come and join us. Come and join us in preparing for Celebration Earth in mid-September, and tell us what you will do differently as a result of this crisis, as a result of being members of an eco church. Come and join us in walking a different path. As the disciples walked out of Jerusalem, they walked into a new, unimaginable future. Well, that's what we can do. And join us in your prayers. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to say a welcome here to those who joined us from beyond our partnership churches Friends of Community are many partners in community well-being, and friends around the country, indeed overseas, welcome us particularly to tonight. And in that spirit, Martin, the first question, it's a partnership question. Led with myself and Margaret Anderson, your former, not your older history teacher. She informs me, Martin, this last Wednesday, she prepared you for your O-level history paper in 1970 at Cornwall School, where Hugo, our youngest son, would have done his GCSEs if there'd been no pandemic. So our question, Martin, is this. What would you say to your 16-year-old self about life lessons you have learnt along the way these last 50 years, which would have helped you then, and also might strengthen 20 young people like two of our sons today in all the anxieties and mental health challenges they're facing as a result of COVID-19?
First of all, never trust your former history teacher at all, clearly. I will deal with her later. However, it is rather a good question. I actually have a photograph in my study just here of me aged 14 with my godfather, who I love. He's still alive. And I sometimes look at that picture and I wonder if I'm doing what my 14-year-old would hope. I think I've been very blessed, to be honest, because I enjoy being alive. I love humor. I love parties. I love being with people. I love discovering new things. I love challenges, and I realize I'm very lucky in that. For a lot of people, challenges are deeply threatening. They are frightening. And at the moment, for many young people, there really is just a mist in front. I mean, you know, if you're trying to do your exams, or if you're thinking about going to university, what will this university be? Will it just be, there was a lovely cartoon in one of the papers today, and somebody a couple of people looking at a photograph of a boy, you know, a young man in a frame on a sideboard, and the mother saying, oh yes, he's reading history and economics in his bedroom. I think it is a very strange world out there. I think the only thing I would say is grasp it firmly, make it what you would like it to be, and work out what it is you would like it to be. I was very fortunate. I grew up in a family where my father was a vicar, and my father just knew that God was love. That's it. God was love. That's all he needed to know. And his entire life was showing and living that with the people he worked with. My mother was an atheist until she met my father, because my grandfather was what we would now call a New Age con man, and he used to travel the seaside resorts of England reading people's fortunes. And he disappeared from her life when he was 14. So my mother said a pox on all religion, all spirituality, all that stuff. And it took my father quite a long time to even persuade her to go out with him, never mind to marry him. But my mother brought a very healthy skepticism, a very healthy approach of test it. Don't just accept it, test it, push it, probe it, find out, question it. So I had my father's absolute knowledge that God was love, and my mother's absolute question that if it was God was love, why was the world in such a dreadful mess? And I think you have to walk between those poles, and you have to find your own pathway through. I found that because I was fortunate enough to go to Hong Kong to work for a year. I found it by, well, actually, I ended up studying theology because they wouldn't let me do geology, and I thought it sounded similar. I was in for quite a bit of a surprise, it has to be said, but what it taught me was the wonderful thing about religion is that religion is about poetry, it's about stories, it's about truths, it's about the unimaginable, it's about hope, it's about lunacy, it's dangerous, it's fascinating. And I think the thing is never to lose the sense that this is an utterly fascinating world. And that our quest, if you like, in creating a better future is to go back to remembering how blessed we are to have this world, and to find out what we can do to make sure that it continues to be blessed, not just by God, not just by itself, but by us as well. So I think live the adventure, get out there, and if the universities don't decide to do what you want to do something else, but do it.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Reminder, friends, to please type in your questions so we can use this next 40 minutes to dig deeper into the treasure we've been given in the webinar so far from Martin. Martin, questions have come in terms of the environmental challenges. Now, you were planning for the Glasgow summit, and I suppose the thing is, do you think governments will keep to their commitments? And if they won't, what will happen, which we might take advantage of in order to pass on the world in good shape?
Yes, we have been asked by the government to help. We've been asked by the government to help bring a civil society program to the Glasgow climate change meeting, which was due for this November. And we had said, no, we won't. We won't bring it for that, because frankly, as I said earlier, this is the 26th conference at which over 25,000 people will fly in to talk about how to save the planet. It really is quite ludicrous at one level. But it's been the only instrument whereby governments have been put on the spot, and we did help back in 2015 to create a different atmosphere within which it was possible to get the Paris Agreement. However, the COP has now been postponed probably till early to midsummer next year, and there's no kind way of saying it, it will be a disaster. We are already seeing, and we were hearing this in the commission in the Vatican on post-COVID, of governments that are saying, well, you know, in order to get business and industry back to normal, we are going to have to loosen the environmental laws. You know, we're going to have to allow logging in that area. We're going to have to allow mining in that area. We're going to have to reduce the criteria for clean water so that we can discharge and not prosecute people. We're going to have to relax labor laws so that people can work longer hours and be paid less. So we are going to see a massive erosion of what has been gained painfully, slowly, over decades in terms of environmental legislation. We're also going to see many, many governments, hopefully not the European Union and Britain, but many other governments backpedaling on their commitments to cut to carbon neutral by 2050. Because so many people are going to say, well, you know, I mean, that's a lovely idea. Of course, we'd love to have done it. But frankly, we've got to get the industries up. We've got to use up this oil because it's cheaper and it's there anyway, and we've got to use it. And you know, well, everybody's going to have to drive because nobody wants to go in public transport. So, you know, we're just going to have to live with higher levels of pollution in the cities, which will probably kill more people in this country in 1 year than the crisis is going to kill through air pollution. So we are, and we work very closely with the UN, very closely indeed, but nobody is very optimistic about what will come out of the governments. And also there'll be no money. There won't be the money to go into the Green Fund, for example, that was designed to, for example, put about $7 billion a year into climate change mitigation programs. So that's going to be depressing. So the role of the faiths, the role of civil society, has grown exponentially. And now we are being asked by the government, being asked by the UN, please help the faiths to come up with long-term plans, with major commitments about how they will cut their emissions, how they will purchase ethically, how they will support the small and local, not the multinational, how they will educate for a better future, how they will up their hospital and welfare and care programs, because many governments, particularly in the developing world, will collapse in those areas. So at no time, I would argue, in probably the last 300 years, have the religions been more important for the well-being of the planet. We've been ridiculed as obscurantist, irrelevant, left out, old-fashioned for the last 200 years or so. We've been told that we're not scientific, we're not coherent enough, we're not modern enough. Well, look where that all got us. And running the organization I do, Faith Invest, and advising WWF on their program on beliefs and values, and other groups like the International Network on Conservation and Religion, the United Nations Environment Program, Faiths for the Earth, we know that we have never previously had so many secular organizations coming to us and saying, help. We don't know what to do, and we don't know why to do it. We don't know what's going to drive us to do things differently. We don't even know what we've got that we can do differently. But we do. We've been here before. We'll be here in 1,000 years' time. Our role now is to help the world through civil society, through the faiths, through schools, through NGOs, to actually develop models and practice that will compensate for the fact that our national governments and our international agencies simply are not geared up to move fast enough, more deeply enough, more truthfully enough. So we will hold in May next year a meeting before the COP, or the climate COP, at which all these commitments will be made. And it is anticipated that this could well be the largest single civil society movement ever, because there won't be much else. And because civil society has rediscovered itself through this crisis. We have got through this crisis because of what people did, far more than what governments did. So let's not lose that.
Thank you. Martin, just to give you a break for a moment, friends around the world, remember you're unique. Sybil, you'll be aware of the rainbow is the NHS, and there are rainbows all over the place. Well, there's outside Christ Church on the flagpole there, a rainbow flag with the NHS insignia on both sides of it. I think it's probably a unique flag. I know it's been a great comfort to Gross Hospital staff and for all those applauding. This question has come in from somebody on the front line who's written this question. I work in healthcare, keeping people alive, not just healthy, where non-biodegradable stuff is single use only. How do I get my head around this conflict?
Yeah, that's a very profound and very difficult question, to be honest. I think, let's think about what has happened in our attitudes towards plastic in the last 3 years. 4 years ago, it would have been inconceivable that there would be such a mass movement against the use of plastic that cafes would no longer be providing plastic straws, that train buffets would no longer be providing or would encourage you not to have one of their plasticky paper cups, mostly plasticky. There has been an absolute revolution against plastic in the space of about 3 years, and we can lay that comfortably at Attenborough's door because he alerted people in a way that almost nobody else could ever have done. The problem is that a change like that takes a very long time to filter through the industrial system, and the industrial system is set up to use the cheapest and the easiest of materials, and that is plastic. That is materials which are non-biodegradable. My sense is that were this crisis to have happened in 10 years' time, we would, in answer to that very profound question, we would actually have materials that could be recycled. It would be inconceivable that a major government structure would be purchasing material that was actually destroying the planet, and particularly that is killing the oceans, and not just the oceans, but is killing us. The number of microplastics in our bodies is terrifying. So I suppose what I'm saying is, raise that issue in your hospital, raise that issue with your MP, raise that with your professional association, and say, why are we using material which itself will probably create more deaths than the virus we're confronting? Why can we not now look to source biodegradable material? It's there, it's possible, it's just that there hasn't been that demand yet. It's heading that way. And it's one of the most remarkable things I've seen in 45 years of working in the environmental movement, has been this revolt against plastic. And it will come. But this is an opportunity to say, why did we have to have this kind of material? Can we, when we start to plan for the next crisis, can we make sure that we have material that is reusable or recyclable or both?
Martin, you've talked about civil society, and we're all part of that. What can we do as a collective of local churches representing Old Town area of thousands of people, 12,000 people maybe, to help influence our local business people towards an eco agenda? Any examples worldwide or this country of where or how you've seen this happen effectively?
Well, one of my favorite stories on that is the United Methodist Church in the United States. It's not one of the biggest ones. As you know, there's about 250 million people in the United States, and the Methodists are about 9 to 10 million in the United States. The Catholics are at 65 million, Southern Baptists and so forth. So it's not the biggest church by any stretch of the imagination. And in a few years ago, the church did a stock take on how much paper it was using. How much paper it was using for the weekly news sheet, for the church newsletters and magazines, for the correspondence, you know, all the stuff, toilet papers, you name it, all that stuff. And they discovered, to their amazement, that the United Methodist Church uses more paper per year than the whole of Sweden. So realizing that they weren't an insignificant economic force, the United Methodist women persuaded every single Methodist church to approach the supplier that supplied them with paper. And in most cases, this was the American multinational Staples. And I think it was the beginning of October, a few years ago, representatives from every Methodist church went into their local Staples and said, hello, you always print for us, or we always buy your paper from you to use for our services. We want to have FSC certified ecological paper. This is the most ecological paper there is. And every single Staples pretty much said the same thing. Oh, I'm well, terribly sorry, there's no demand. So the United Methodist Church across the United States, with a few, a few not following the lead, withdrew their purchasing from Staples. Within a month, Staples had introduced 7 environmentally sound forms of paper, because the economic clout of the United Methodist, although it was only 10 million out of 250 million, was enough to make a company change its purchasing policy. So that's one example. We are powerful in what we buy. We, as a church, as churches, you can go to the local supermarket or the local store and say, right, we need biscuits that are organic. We need milk that is organic. We need fair trade products like a sugar, for example, or coffee. And we would like to have this particular range and we will purchase from you once you've done that. We have been muted by a sense that we weren't very significant. We are. And then when they say, oh, well, terribly sorry, there's no demand, then you go somewhere else and you put a notice in the parish magazine saying, very sorry to say, we're no longer going to buy from X supermarket because they don't accord with our values. And then you find someone else. And a very good example, again, the Methodists. I mean, the Methodists can be quite good on this. They had in London a international student house near Euston Station, which had been built in the days in the 50s and 60s when particularly African students were refused lodging by landladies. So they built all over the country these international centres. And this was really about the last one left because that, thank God, has changed. And so they started creating a bit of it into sort of small hotel at the top of the building, and the rest was for students. And then they decided actually the students didn't need them. So they would convert the whole place into a hotel. And we were using this regularly because it met with some of our values. It was a religious organization. But one day we sat and we said, are these eggs free range? And the manager went, oh no, they're too expensive and nobody would want them. Whereupon Victoria Finlay, my wife, said, but you're Christians. How can you possibly condone not having free eggs? How can you condone the cruelty of Battery Farms? And the manager said, oh no, well, it's just not economic. And she said, I think you'll find it is. That created a whole re-evaluation by the Methodist Church of its purchasing power for this particular place. It now runs its own organic, fair trade, free range supply system for hundreds of churches and organizations across London, from the Quakers opposite them, opposite Euston Station, who have converted all their food into organic, free range, fair trade, to hundreds of churches, mosques as well, synagogues. So start is the answer. Do something. Decide something that will actually say to people, oh my goodness, and then tell people when you've done it. So when you are doing, tea after church, have something on the table which says our milk is organic, our biscuits are organic, etc., etc. Tell people what you do, because they'll only find out if you actually tell them. And then they may well follow suit. I'll give you an example. We've been working with WWF UK for 35 years, nearly 40 years actually. And I've developed all their religious programs. We have a policy within Faith Invest, as we had in the Alliance of Religions and Conservation, as we have with all our other religious environmental groups, that we only serve vegetarian food. And it has to be organic and local. WWF would always serve us sandwiches. They were never organic. They were never local. They were never fair trade. It took us 30 years of criticizing that and of eventually bringing our own sandwiches for them to change their purchasing policy. So we can be prophetic, but also, let's be frank, very often what we switch to is far more delicious, far more entertaining, maybe more expensive. But if we can't put our money where our mouth is, literally, I'm not sure quite what we've got to say.
Martin, you challenged us tonight with that phrase, not thy kingdom come, but our kingdom come. And, again, for friends around the world watching this, listening to this tonight, our ecumenical heritage, ecumenical is not often used so much today as a word. What does it really mean to be ecumenical today? And the passion which your dad had, which you have, you're very home in your own skin. So how can we be ecumenical in a pluralistic world today?
Well, I think some in that last phrase, you put your finger on it. We live in a pluralistic world. We have lived through the last I suppose, 150 years of a monumental experiment to make everybody the same. It began with the Christian missionaries in the 19th century, particularly the Protestant ones, going out to convert the world. And there was a movement in the 1920s that literally said the conversion of the world in this generation. There was that sense of confidence. This was particularly based on the great empires, the British Empire, French Empire, and so forth, and then later the American Empire, that this was proof that we were going to conquer the world, that Christian values, Christian civilization was going to convert the world. That then spawned terrifying offspring, communism and fascism. It spawned consumerist capitalism, all of which basically said, be the same. Do as we say, be the same. If everybody believes in communism, we can have the socialist paradise on earth. If everybody believes in fascism, we can be the strongest, most virile nations in the world, and we can be in charge. The empire builders were, if you just follow our model, look, you could end up looking like Slough. Oh, sorry, Slough. In other words, we took out this model that we believed that if everybody was the same as us, the world would be a better and happier place. And that hangs on. That hangs on. And the number of environmental groups who just say, look, you know, we know how to save the world. And you go, no, you don't actually. You've got some very good ideas, but frankly, what you would have to do is convert everybody to believe what you believe, and that's just not going to happen, is it? So we've gone through these massive attempts to make everybody believe and do and follow the same thing, and it does not work. We have had more destructive wars, we've had more violence, we've created more destruction of our planet under this quest for one answer than anything else. So for me, it is pluralism. It is the fact that there will always be a variety of stories. I've spent my working life primarily working with environmentalists. And what have they taught me? They've taught me that as a Christian, my belief in God means that I see biodiversity, the sheer amazing abundance of species, as the way that God has chosen for life to continue and flourish. There are going to be species that are dying out. There will be species emerging. There will be species that are benevolent. There will be species that are vicious. All this is part of the creative energy of God. Well, if that's how God helps evolution to continue and to grow, and for this planet to go through huge changes, including our own, but the ones that have happened in the past, I actually think that God rather likes conceptual and faith diversity. And one of the things my father taught me very early on was that ecumenical did not mean all the same. That if a group did not feel that they had something of their own to bring and to share and to have people go, good heavens, that's fantastic. I'd never thought of it like that. Then that's not ecumenical. That's simply and probably the Church of England just trying to make everybody do what they do. So for me, ecumenical, in the same way that multi-faith, is about pluralism. It's about a diversity of answers, a diversity of models, a diversity of ways of thinking, because none of our belief systems by itself is adequate to get us through these crises. None of them. But together, side by side, each of us coming proud of our own traditions, but humble enough to listen, we can make an amazing mixture from which new possibilities can emerge. So for me, ecumenical means embracing and delighting in the other and finding together that side by side we can be more powerful, but side by side does not mean you following me.
As a follow-on, we've been asked, Martin, this question. Is the worldwide COVID emergency a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for all the faiths to combine to drive change through faith, to teach us all about environment and sustainability, and how can we open ourselves to this conversation?
Yes, I think it is. I think it is well, I hope to God it's a once in a lifetime opportunity. I mean, we don't know. If we don't change the way we abuse nature, it may be simply a harbinger of more to come. And that in itself should warn us. But one of the things, again, that I've learnt from working with environmentalists, and I'm a theologian, I'm a religious studies historian, I'm a China scholar, I'm not a natural scientist. What I've learned from them is that when an area has been devastated by industrial pollution, by fire, by warfare, leave it alone long enough and nature will return. It will come back and it will reclaim what is its own. It will find its own way of purifying the soil or the water, but you have to give it time. Now, I think that's our role. I think we are the ground springs of the new birth. And if we're not, then we're just going to be part of the desert that comes out of this. We have to be the signs of possibility and hope. We have to, for example, put our money, whether that's investments or our donations, into the things that we really want to see, the things that will really make a difference, the things that would not have happened if we didn't do that. We need to make our buildings available for the kind of things that probably won't happen. Many of our theatres, many of our arts centres, many of our great performance places, many of our communal places will never open again. But our churches will, and most of the time they're empty. So make them available. Make them places where communities rediscover themselves again. So I think, yes, I do think that this offers us a once in a lifetime opportunity. We've got to be very careful that in saying that, we don't make it sound as though this is what God did. This is no act of God. This is an act of humanity and stupidity. But out of it, we have to seize the chance of a better future. If we don't, if we just fall back into that language of, oh, how soon can we get back to normal? We will have betrayed the possibility that has been offered to us in the most terrible of ways, but it is a possibility. And I would say, look at what happened after the Second World War with the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan helped rebuild Europe after the devastation of the war. We as faiths need to be creating our own Marshall Plan. We need to be systemic. We need, for example, in Swindon, to look at what will have gone. What small businesses, what bookshops, what cafes, what little places that were important, what have gone? How can we nurture those again? Not necessarily the same ones, but create the space, literally, physically, we've got the buildings, nurture the funding for them, nurture the enthusiasm and the articulation for them. That's what we need to do. We need to look around and see where needs our help and where that help might actually help us to live in a better world. So no, I don't believe this has been given to us by God, but I think God gives us the tools to come out of this and not, hopefully not head into another human crisis like this.
Coming, Martin, into the home lap, so your energy is renewed, and questions have been put to us, but I want to slightly adapt it. How do we stop just spawning programs, really change people's attitudes? But personally, how can I, as a human being, change my wrong attitudes?
That's a very good question indeed. And I think, having worked with the United Nations, the World Bank and so forth for many, many years, I have seen hundreds of programs being launched that fizzle out after 3 or 4 years because people lose interest or the money dries up and things like that. So I think that's a very profound question. I think the changes have to come from what we want to do rather than from what we feel we're obliged to do. And there is a huge difference. What we feel we're obliged to do, we will do in order that we can rest easy for the rest of the year. what we want to do should drive what we do for the rest of the year. It's as fundamental a difference as that. A program is something that we do for other people to do in order that we don't have to think about it again for a while. A real commitment is what we decide to do. And that commitment, Simon, I think comes down to looking at our assets. What do we own? I remember once, well, a thing I used to do, and I do this still occasionally, is when I've got a group in a hall, I will stop halfway through and I'll say, right, will you just get into 3s and 4s? And will you just talk about how many budgets you control? How many budgets do you have an influence over? Obviously, there's your own personal budget. There's your church or your synagogue, your mosque's budget. There's the school your children go to. There's the business you work for. There's the sports club you belong to. There's the voluntary group you belong to. There's the charity you support. How many budgets could you actually have an influence over? On average, a group of 3 or 4 middle-class English Christians will be in touch with anywhere between £3 to £5 million worth of annual budget for things like travel or energy or paper or resources. So that's one area. And actually, we did have one wonderful moment where one of the groups kind of grinned. And I said, all right, so how much have you got? And they said 28 million. And we went, what? Because they happen to have the man who purchases all the paper for Gideon's Bible in their group. So we can actually have way more influence than we expect if you have a vision of what you would like to see that be and do. We can do it in our own lives. We literally can change the world a meal at a time by what we purchase. We can change it in terms of where we invest. We can change it in terms of saying to our pension fund, okay, I don't want to be in that, but I do want to be in this. I want to be in a green bond. I want to be in climate solutions investing. We individually each can do that. And then I think the role for the churches is to become the sum total of that. So one thing that we encourage churches to do is not just to do an audit of the church. You know, what's your energy use, what's your paper use, your travel, so on and so forth, which is fine. But to actually ask families and individuals and businesses and organizations associated with the church to, over a period of 3 or 4 months, do a complete audit of what they buy, what they control, what they influence. And then on a particular Sunday, say in Creation Tide, that period from September the 1st to October the 4th, to actually come up to the altar and lay on the altar what they are committing to do with those resources. Because the church is not just the building and the clergy. The church is the people of God. But we very rarely ask the people of God to join us in any kind of action other than to put money in the collection plate and say amen. So actually empowering people and saying, what are you going to do? Because together it is possible that Christ Church and the other churches individually and then collectively could, by the end of Creation Tide this year, October the 4th, St. Francis Day, actually show a huge potential ability to change the economy in Swindon and to be influencing other economies around the world. You have the power.
Final question, Martin. Thinking of young people, and you're a young person in Swindon, your O-levels 1970 at 16 years old, but what is the substance of your hope, and how can we communicate hope in a troubled world today?
My hope is at one level in the sheer creativity of people, especially when they are given the opportunity and the space and the encouragement to be creative. I never cease to be amazed when you take people out of the normal rut. By God, this is what's happened with this one, and ask them to do something different. I mean, think about this. This is extraordinary. I mean, at a very simple level, I haven't traveled by train to come and see you. People haven't driven up to Christ Church or to the Methodist Church for this event. We're all sitting at home. I mean, we've really, we've cut some emissions straight away. We can change. So I'm always encouraged by the sheer creativity of people. I suppose at heart I am powerfully moved by the sheer generosity of nature. Whether you believe that's a manifestation of God or whether you just think it is this extraordinary thing called nature. For me, creation is love with all its pain and struggles because it comes from God. So we are surrounded by love. Look at that psalm that we had, Psalm 148. We're called upon to just say, oh, wow, look at all this stuff. Thank you, God. So if we can get back to saying that and then think, where are we in it? Because one of our fundamental problems, and much of our education actually endorses this, is that we see ourselves as apart from nature. We're the observers, we're the controllers. I work with groups who talk about ecosystem deliverables. What they mean is, how useful is the Amazon to absorb our CO2? Not, isn't the Amazon amazing? Probably something like 1/4 of all species live in the Amazon. It is the lungs of the planet. No. It's only useful because it absorbs our CO2. Now that is standing apart. That is believing that this planet was made for us. It was not. We will probably be one of the shortest lived species on this planet. The trilobite was around for 250 million years, from roughly around about 400 million years ago to around about 150 million years ago, roughly. Fantastic species. Adapted, grew, changed, etc. And then it died out. But it went on for 250 million years. We've been around as this particular species, this particular form of Homo sapiens, for maybe 100,000 years. I don't think we're going to be a long-term species on this planet. So what we can do is remember that we're not apart from. This planet was not made for us. We are not the masters of this planet. We are a part of nature. And the moment we remember we're a part of nature, we cannot treat it as though it is just a supermarket for us to raid. We have to treat it as brothers and sisters, mothers and fathers of our own lives, in exactly the way that St. Francis did. We are a family. For God's sake, let's start acting like one.
Pause, and then Martin, will you lead us in the prayer? St. Teresa's prayer, your father's favourite prayer, and the prayer which is your passion and the heart of your hope.
Absolutely. So please join me in this prayer of St. Teresa, who lived in the 16th century, a time of horrendous change, of enormous destruction, violence, cruelty, stupidity. And this is the prayer she wrote in response to that crisis. Christ has no body but yours, no hands, no feet on earth but yours. Yours are the eyes with which he looks compassion on this world. Yours are the feet with which he walks to do good. Yours are the hands with which he blesses all the world. Yours are the hands, yours are the feet, yours are the eyes, you are his body. Christ has no body now but yours, no hands, no feet on earth but yours. Yours are the eyes with which he looks compassion on this world. Christ has no body now on earth but yours.
On behalf of us all, Martin, thank you very much for sharing your passion for life, for God, for creation and for hope for the future. Hugely appreciate your commitment to us and deeply moved that you have this enduring link with us here in Swindon. As Martin said, we give a grateful thanks to you, Phil and Stephen, for your hard work today over tonight's webinar, our first in the Ecumenical Partnership. We've had about 30 logins tonight, probably more than that. Can I encourage you to, as an action point, go on your social media and send the link to this webinar when it comes out, probably 24 hours time, so people can take part in this. A significant people will be listening to this over the weekend. We'd love to hear how you've reacted to this, how the ideas shared germinate and grow within you over these coming days and weeks. If you want to have a definite invitation to Martin's Friends of Christ Church lecture in the autumn, then email us in and we'll make sure you have that available. Hopefully we also will be either live Zoom or recorded. But Martin, thank you very much indeed. We particularly want to, God bless Celebration Earth. If you don't know Celebration Earth, go on their website and see the resources there. Can't stress enough the excellence of the Lent series which we used here, which all those talks and material is on the site. So Martin, God bless you and your family, and thank you for all you shared with us tonight. It's been asked to say a final prayer as we think of all those tonight who suffer with COVID-19, Great Western Hospital, those who've lost their lives, all working on behalf in education and healthcare, in business, community well-being, to care for our fellow human beings, and to cry out for our own prayer. And now, friends, the peace of God, which passes all understanding, keep your hearts and minds in knowledge of the God and of his Son, Jesus Christ, our Lord. And the blessing of God Almighty, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit rest upon you, upon God's world, our country, Swindon, all those whom we love, pray for and serve, tonight, for the pandemic, and into the future, God's future always. Amen. Good evening. Thank you.